Okay, let's begin. Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Creating an Electronics Inventory System with Python, Flask and MongoDB. I'm Fuzzy, this is FuzzyTek, the show where I talk about technical, geeky, nerdy stuff, if you didn't know that already. And today we are going to be creating some of the front end. It might not all work, but it will be in a stage where it'll be there ready to work. So to begin with, I've created this basic piece of HTML that all it really does is just be a placeholder for a table that will hold our components. At the moment it looks like this. Very simple table here. We've got our menu here and the footer and the header from before. What we need to do is use Jinja, as in Jinja, not Ginger, to put in information from the Python app.py into the HTML. The same as we've done with the include header and the include footer, except it's a bit different. I will do this for now, and if it needs tweaking or whatever, we can do that in the future. There's no real need to get everything perfect straight away. For some people there may be, but for me there isn't. So we create a table with a table row, and inside that row we're going to add this piece of Jinja, which will be a for loop. So for header in table headers. Now we haven't created table headers yet, but they will be these bits. So name, description, location. I'll set those in Python and let Jinja create them for the table headers. You'll see as we go along, it will make more sense if you don't get it already. So th is table header, so we've got table, table row, and then for header in table headers, create a th that will say we'll have the header inside, and then we need to end the loop. So to do that we do, no, I've messed it up. There we go. We do % end for %, and that will end our for loop for that row. Then we want another one that will do the components, so that will list all the rows for the components. So we do for row in table components, we'll call it. Again, that doesn't yet exist, but that will be each component from the database that gets sent into this HTML file will be in this table components, and each one of those will contain another. Let me give you an example. It will look like, so in the pretend this is the app.py, so we'll have table components like this. Each one will be a list, or it's called a tuple actually, a list of each component. So LED, it lights up, etc. And then there'll be another one below it that'll be a different component. So it'll all be contained within this one array, tuple, whatever it's called. But that's what we're doing now. We're doing that part. So that will be for row in table components. We need a table row, and inside the table row we need a cell, which is obviously a table cell. So we'll do for cell in row, we will create table data. I think that means table data, and that will be cell. And then we need to end the for. So that ends the cell for. And then here we need to end the one for each row. So this will create each component, and then for each, and put it in a row, and then for each component in the row, or for each cell in the component, each value in the component, such as name, description, will create a cell for that value for each row. That's what I mean to say. It sounds confusing when you try and explain something, but it's really not. So now we've created that, we're going to test it out with some data. So if we go back in app.py, here we've got components to add, then we've got data, name, data, description from last time. But we want to be able to send this data to the index file, similar how we've done with the config. To do that, I'm going to just make a test one up here that will be table components equals, and then just as I explained earlier, we'll have a tuple in a tuple in a tuple, tupleware, which will be LED. It lights up. I can't remember what everything else was, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if this makes any sense in comparison to this, because it will just fill it up with whatever information is there. So we've got location, amount, and data sheet. I'll do those. So I'll do, what did we say it was? Draw 1B. There's 12 of them, and the data sheet link is google.com. And then we'll do two components. So we'll have a I said diode last time, even though an LED is a diode, so it sometimes lights up. Question mark. And that's in draw 1C, and we've got 3 of those. And this doesn't have a data sheet, even though it's more likely to be the other way around. Anyway, so what we'll do is we'll send, as well as the config, we'll send that table components. So how did I put it in here? I should have kept it the same, because I put for header in table headers, for row in table, oh yeah, I need to do table headers, but yeah, table components and table headers. So we'll do table headers equals table headers, table components equals table components. And I'll create another one of these which will hold the headers, although this one could probably just stay here. Oh, it's not a function. This one will have name and then description. I could hard code this into the HTML, to be honest with you, but I'd rather have the HTML just reflect whatever happens in the Python script. So if I change the Python script, it will just reflect it in the HTML regardless. I don't have to go backwards and forwards too much to change things if I want to. That's why I'm just putting the table headers in this and just hard coding them in. Anyway, name, description, location, amount, and datasheet. So these are set to that. They're being sent to the index HTML file, and the index HTML file is converting them to a table on our front page. So let's see how it runs and hope it works. And there we go. We've got name, description, location, amount, datasheet. It looks a bit jumbled up, but that's because we have no CSS styling going on here. It's just the default thing. But don't worry about that at the moment. But we know that it works. So what? Oh, I spelled sometimes wrong. I bet someone noticed that at the time. It's that thing again, where you're watching a video and you notice the person make a mistake, and you wonder how long it's going to take them to notice. Well, I didn't, so it doesn't matter about that anyway. It's just a test. The table headers will remain the same. I'll fill in the rest of them, obviously. but the components will be returned from a function. I could just put them inside here, but I like to have a function for each separate thing that goes on, so I can call it from anywhere if I need to. Or is it called a function or a method in Python? I'm not sure. Anyway, whatever, you know what I mean. So this will stay the same. This will be a function, because so we can call it get, I don't know, get, wait, should it be lowercase, get underscore component data. And the reason I can pass that function into there as a function and not just using a variable like this is because the function will return something like this. So I can cut that away and I can use it in my function somewhere. I'm going to put it here because it's below table headers. So we'll define get component, what was it? Data? Yes. Data. And then that will have this inside it, and it will return table components. So we should now be able to run it again and see the result of this. So this will help me keep everything in one place that will get the component information from the database. So this won't be hard coded in a moment. We'll change it to get information from the database and then return it. And although we don't yet have anything in the database, I will work on adding stuff that next, and then this will all come together a bit better. So if we test this out, it should work exactly the same. So let's rerun, open this. And yes, it's exactly the same, which is what we want. So I can close this again. And it will return table components. At the moment, we don't have anything to be returning because we haven't accessed the database to actually get the components. And we'll do that right here. So I don't know if this is exactly correct, but something like this should get all of the components within our components collection. And then I will add them into the table components and so on. But before we can do that, we need to be able to actually add some to the database. So I will go into add.html and create a form that will add everything necessary, and then we can style it later and put it wherever we need it and so on. So let's do that now. Let's go into add.html and create the form a bit better. So we don't need ID because that's set by MongoDB. But I'll use this to put in the ones we do need. So we need the name equals name, ID equals name. And then here we have component name. It doesn't need to say component name, it can just say name. It doesn't really matter, but I'll leave it as component name. Let's make a gap so we can see what's going on. Let's copy and paste. Ooh, you've moved over. Naughty. So after name, we've got description. So description. And then that will be here. Description. Some of these might want to actually be a form field rather than, or a text field rather than just a line input, but we can figure that out after, it doesn't matter. So description, and then we need, I think location was next. So location. I had an idea. Instead of typing all these out, why don't I use these table headers like we did here to create these in a for loop? Do you know what? I'm going to do that. Okay, so I've copied this from the other index HTML file, and this won't be a table header with header in it, but you know, I'll change that now. So for header in table headers, we want to put this. So we can cut this and delete this. ID is header, name is name, for is name, and in here is header. So now that should be a bit better. So we need to pass in table headers into this file. I will change the name of it though, from table headers to something else. I'll change it to say component headers. I could have refactored it, doesn't matter. And then I'll copy this into add, down, okay, so after spending some time jiggling around the adding to database, because this one before it was called add item and it only accepted posts, and I was trying to return the render template and it didn't make any sense. So the problem was this was never going to work returning and adding stuff. So this is only for adding things to the database. It is called by /add to DB and it only accepts a post from a form or whatever. And add component is the page that is going to go to add.html where you can add a component. So it takes in is added, which will be a boolean, true or false. When a component is added, it will return true. I'll do error handling and stuff like that later, so if there's an error it will return false. But if it's added is none, it returns false, which means it will tell you it's never added. So we don't need this. We can just say added is added, and if it's none, it's none. It doesn't matter, it won't do anything with it. So now in here, if added is true, it got added. Otherwise it doesn't matter. It can say pink lemons, it will still never show. So this should be ready to add a component. As we can see here, everything works. I've filled in some information. The only issue is we don't have all of the headers, and that is because up here we haven't listed all of the headers. So I need to fill those in, because this is looking for all of them, and if it doesn't find them we get an error. So I need to fill these in and then we can test it out. And because these are reflecting these, they'll need to be the same. So we need a capital N, we need a capital D, and so on. Not here we don't though, just on the data ones. We don't need entry date and updated date either, I just realised. Although they will be in the headers of the table. Okay, let's see what happens. Footprint will be 2-pin amount. These ones I'm going to leave blank, and I'm going to not include them in the form. And then we get it got added. So let's remove entry date and updated date from the form, because that will be today's date. And the reason they're in there is because it's coming from the table headers here, which is also here going into the add component page. Here, if you'll notice, we have our 4 headers in component headers create the form for adding a new component. But in our component headers, we have an entry date and an updated date, which we don't want to display on this form. We don't want to fill in the date because it's today, now, always. And the same with the entry date especially. Updated date will change when we edit an item, but not when we initially add one. So we need to not display these in our HTML. To do this, we can use an if statement here that will say if not entry date in header and not updated date in header, and then here we can end if. So what this says is, as long as it's not entry date or updated date, make a form field for it. Otherwise, don't bother. Now there's probably better ways of doing this, but this is the way that I have decided to do it. So if we load the page, we go / add component, you'll see there's no entry date and there's no updated date in the form. This allows us to use the same component headers as this in getting the data, adding the data, updating the data everywhere using the same one. I could hard code it because the headers are unlikely to change, but if they do change, I just need to add one to here and then add it into here, and everywhere else I'll end update, but everywhere else it should be the same. I wouldn't have to add it in a million places if I decide to add an extra one, only 3 or 4. This is on GitHub by the time you watch this video. It will be on there. It hasn't been in the first 2 videos. It might be on there by this video, I'm not sure. I want it on a somewhat working state before I make it public, because this isn't a tutorial, so you're not supposed to really follow along with it. You just see the building of a project and then you can take it and do what you want with it once it's working to a basic standard. Anyway, we need to test out that we can actually add to the database using this form. So here in Robo 3T we have 0 components in our database. We're going to add some using this page and make sure that it adds correctly. So I'm going to add diode, sometimes lights up, draw 1C, 2 pin, 3. Now I know I did this earlier. It may or may not be in this video, I don't know if I've cut it out, but I did this earlier and it messed up. So I'm doing it again, not including the entry date and the updated date because they are set automatically or set from the code rather than manually. Datasheet will have NA comment hello. So I'll submit this. It says here it got added, big smiley face. Now in Robo 3T we should be able to reload, and here we have an entry with an ID. There's its ID, it's a diode, and it's got all the things we entered, including the entry date and the updated date, the same date, and they are of type date, and a comment hello. So this works. adding works, and our parts list doesn't yet work, but it will once we sort that out properly. So we'll do that next, and then we'll do updating the data. So after a lot of messing around, I eventually managed to get component data working correctly. Now this is a tuple. You also have a list and dictionary. And that will go into there, which in turn creates this. I've added a 555 timer, so we didn't just have one item in there. And as you can see, they're not in the right columns, but that's okay because we have the ID here, which will be here, but we won't be able to see it. It's there because if we press, eventually there'll be a button here that says update, or edit or whatever. If we press that, it will know that it's editing this ID, and it will feed that ID back through the form to update that particular item in the database. So after a lot of messing around and not understanding tuples and dictionaries and lists, I eventually got this to return a list instead of a tuple. I don't know if it really made any difference, but I think it looks a bit neater and I understand it a little bit more. And so that means in index, all I had to do to get it to not show the ID, to not return the ID, is to do this. So the ID is in the data, but it's omitted from the cells. So that means that it looks like this. And I will use that ID for when the user will click on edit part, and it will come up with a modal or a window or whatever with more information inside to edit the part, including the ID. So the database knows which ID to be updating and stuff like that. So that's where we're up to at the moment. I think next will be perhaps adding a couple more pieces and then making an update modal to edit the pieces. So let's add one more just so we've got a variety. I don't know, I think we don't need to add more. I just feel like adding another one might be nice. And then we can also edit how the date is displayed, because at the moment it's a bit crazy. So let's add a new component. And this can be a resistor. Description is location is part bin 5. Footprint, the resistor can be an 0805. We've got 35 of them. Datasheet can be at a URL, and the comment can be nothing. Submit. It got added. So we go back to the parts list, and there's the resistor added in. The datasheet will also we'll figure out a way eventually to have these link to the actual sheet. We'll get to that later. We'll finish adding and editing things in the database first before we move on to anything else, including styling so it actually looks quite nice, and adding a system settings page and things like that. So now we've got 3 items in there. Let's make a way to update them and change this data. So we're going to use a modal from Bootstrap for showing the edit and update screen. One of these things, you know, it pops up and then you close or save changes or close it, or you click away and it disappears. Here's a demo. Woohoo! I think that would be nice to edit the data, and then you press save and it will save and return you back to where you were. Okay, we're not going to use a long one like that, but maybe this kind of one. let's add the modal in. So I'm going to copy and paste this. I'm going to chuck it in below all this stuff, but still above the footer. I'm going to leave all the default stuff in there for now, just to check that it works, and I'll grab the button to make it load, which will become our edit item button. I'm going to paste the button code here in a new table data cell. So what this will do is create another bit on the end with no header that will have a button in it. So that will look like this. Oh dear, this isn't correct. I need to move it below the end 4. So there's one per row, not one per cell. There we go. So these will eventually edit whichever component it's next to, and I'll also change the background of each row or every alternate row so that you can see the difference and scan through it easier. But we'll get to styling later. Let's just make it all work first, and then we'll make it look gorgeous at a later date. I've tidied this up a little bit to make it look a little bit neater, although we'll be doing some stuff with this later. And we've got the modal here. Now you may be wondering why when I click the buttons nothing happens. So down here above the footer we're going to put some JavaScript that's particular to this page. So I've pasted this at the bottom, which probably isn't the best place to put it. This function is basically jQuery that is the same as vanilla JavaScript that says when the document is ready, it's ready to do things here. Something like that. I'm not very good at explaining everything, especially when I haven't wrote it down. So I've downloaded the jQuery min file here, and I'm going to stick it in our JS folder. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to press rename and Control C so that I remember what it's called. Go back into PyCharm, and although at the moment we only need it on this page, we're probably going to need it on most other pages. So I'm going to put it in the header file. So script source is jQuery.min.js, and I should have typed this first, /static/js/. I'm also going to move this to the header. So I'm not entirely sure why, but when I copied this from the modal example page on Bootstrap, it had data-toggle and data-target, and it wasn't working. But when I changed it to data-bs-toggle and data-bs-target, the same with down here in the modal itself, it started to work. For the example, before I go any further, just know that the modal pops up and closes as expected. And what we eventually want to happen is when we press edit component, we get all the component information on the one that we pressed, so it will pass the row of information into the modal, which will let us edit it with a form and save it with the button, and then it will close away and update. I'm going to be using this modal and not really changing too much about it apart from the content. So I'm going to change the ID from example modal center to component edit modal, like that. And the same here and anywhere else This bit will change anyway, but I'm going to put it in just for now. And then of course up here in our button will be component edit modal. So it should still work if we run that. Yes, there we go. Okay, so here's how I've done it. I took a little bit of fiddling around, but I've given the button an ID of component edit button, and I've given it a component data dash component of row, which it gets from here. This is included in this because this only searches through for each cell, not including the first one, for making these. Row itself will always contain the first one, which is the ID, which is what we need to update the component in the database. So that is there, and with that I've created an input box with the name component info and the ID component info with a blank value. And what happens here in the JavaScript, when component edit button is clicked on, it creates a variable component data which contains whichever button clicked it, the component data thing from that, which then puts it into that text box. So here's how it looks. We open this, say we want the diode at the top, edit component. In this text box we have the whole load of information that we can then use anywhere in the module. Obviously it's not all going to stay in this text box, this is just to get it working. And the 555 timer, all the information is there, and the resistor, all the information is in there too, including the ID, which we will need to send when we want to update this particular component when we press save. So that's that. Now we can create an updating function in the Python script back in here that would actually update that thing. But first, let's actually make this look good and list each individual thing that you might want to change. I wonder if we could use how we've done here to create one of the to create all these things instead, so I don't have to do them all manually, because then also if we change any of this it will make more of these to go with it. So let's do that. I'll change, oh no, I'll leave header as header. I will copy this like so, because these are all, you can change all of these apart from the ID. So I'll put that one here separately. But first I'll make this a form, just so it's a bit neater, which should be a bit neater. I will tidy up everything once I've got stuff working. I'll go over everything and tidy it all up. So this is a form. Action will be / update component, and method will be post. It won't do anything yet, of course. And I might put these, I could just make the whole thing a form. Doesn't matter that it's got divs inside of it. This should work. Okay, so we've got our form here. We have the ID, which will be the ID. It's not changed at all. And then we have the headers.